Some battles aren't fought with bullets, they're fought in silence. Arnold Schwarzenegger hadn't worn his medal in public for years, but one grey morning in Bakersfield, he walked into a courtroom holding more than just testimony. He carried history, and when a judge told him to take off that medal, what followed wasn't outrage, it was something deeper, something that reminded everyone in that room what honor really looks like. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. The courtroom in Bakersfield was unusually full for a civil dispute. Outside, the sky was overcast, the kind of grey that settles into the bones. Inside, the wooden benches creaked under the shifting weight of curiosity, and the air hung heavy, like a held breath that no one dared release. The case itself was simple, a land dispute about a patch of forest scarred by fire years ago, but it wasn't the case that filled the gallery. It was the man expected to testify. When he entered, no one announced him. There were no cameras, no entourage, no lingering glances from assistants or journalists. Just an older man, 75 by any fair guess, walking with the careful patience of someone who'd long since abandoned hurry. He wore a plain grey blazer, but on the left side of his chest, just above the heart, gleamed something that didn't belong in that room. A medal, not gaudy, not oversized, but unmistakable to anyone who'd ever seen honor forged into metal. The grand decoration of honor from the Republic of Austria. Some people looked down, others stared openly. A woman in the second row gripped her husband's hand just a little tighter. The man took a seat near the back, silent. His eyes didn't wander. He didn't acknowledge the whispers. He waited. The judge entered from his chambers precisely on time. Judge Harold Whitmore, known for order, efficiency, and a cold intolerance for anything he couldn't control. He didn't look at the attorneys. He didn't nod to the court recorder. His eyes, sharp and calculating, went straight to the medal. He paused, then he sat. The proceedings began as expected, opening statements, legal formalities, the kind of procedural rhythm that lulled most courtrooms into routine until the bailiff called a name that silenced everything else. Mr. Arnold Schwarzenegger, please take the stand. The name rippled through the gallery like a dropped stone, not because of fame, not anymore, but because of weight. He stood slowly and moved toward the front of the courtroom. Every footstep sounded louder than it should have. When he reached the witness stand, before he could sit, the judge raised his hand. "Remove the medal," he said. "This is a court of law, not a stage." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The words dropped like cold iron. Someone near the front gasped. A veteran in the second row lowered his head. No one moved, not even Arnold. From the far corner of the room, a man in dark military dress, barely noticeable until that moment, tilted his head ever so slightly. He did not speak, he did not stand, but his eyes, barely visible beneath the brim of his cap, locked on the judge. Arnold didn't respond. His hand hovered near the medal, and then he paused, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for something or someone far beyond the walls of that room. For a long moment, no one in the courtroom said anything. The silence wasn't passive, it had a shape, a weight, as if the room itself was struggling to absorb what had just happened. Arnold stood still, his hand near the medal, eyes unreadable. Then, without a word, he gently unpinned it. The act was deliberate, not dramatic. He placed it down beside the microphone, as one might place a folded flag on a casket, quietly, with finality. Then he sat. The room felt colder after that, not physically, just quieter, the kind of silence that makes people aware of their own breathing. Every pair of eyes drifted toward him, some openly, some carefully masked. He didn't meet any of them. His posture was relaxed, but not casual. He sat the way men do when they're used to being alone with their thoughts, when they've carried them for too long. To some, he was still that name from old movie posters, that face from action figures and campaign ads. But to those who had stayed in California long enough, who remembered the firestorms and the days that followed, he was something else entirely. After the wildfires swept through Kern County 5 years earlier, when ash fell like snow and entire neighborhoods turned to memory, there were stories, not headlines, stories. About a man, older, quieter than he used to be, who showed up unannounced at evacuation centers with his own truck, driving supplies, carrying crates, handing out blankets without waiting for cameras. One firefighter swore he saw him cooking breakfast for volunteers at 4 a.m., refusing even a thank you. He didn't do interviews, turned down every photo. When asked why he was there, he reportedly said, "Because I can still lift things and they need lifting." That was the version of him now sitting in the witness stand. Not the actor, not the politician, not the icon, just a man who had shown up when others were running. A man whose silence said more than speeches ever could. A junior attorney leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "That's really him, isn't it?" Her voice was barely audible, but the tone wasn't excitement. It was reverence, like seeing a monument breathe. And yet in all that stillness, tension crackled beneath the surface. Not everyone in that room was at ease, especially not the plaintiff's table. The lead petitioner, Douglas Brandt, sat stiffly, arms folded, lips pursed. He avoided looking at Arnold altogether, which was strange because 5 years earlier, during the fire's worst night, it had been Arnold, grey coat, soot-covered face, who helped pull Brandt's unconscious father from a collapsing trailer near the edge of the burn zone. That wasn't public knowledge. Arnold never spoke of it. Brandt never thanked him. Now Brandt sat across from the very man who had saved his family's name from becoming another obituary. And he was suing the town that helped rebuild his property for encroachment, for access rights, for profits. He had signed contracts with developers to turn the restored land into a private retreat. And standing in the way was an easement granted decades ago to the town's volunteer corps. The same one Arnold had helped fund, quietly, anonymously. The irony hung in the room like a low fog. Those who knew didn't speak of it. Those who didn't felt something they couldn't name. Arnold, as always, said nothing, but the space he occupied wasn't empty. It was charged. His presence was less a statement than a question, a quiet, unavoidable question. What does honor look like when it no longer needs to prove itself? No one had an answer, not yet, but they would. Judge Harold Whitmore had presided over this courtroom for nearly 20 years. He was known for his precision, his disdain for sentiment, and his ability to maintain control down to the breath. No cell phones, no outbursts, no exceptions. To him, the law was a machine, cold, consistent, without favor or emotion. And he was its most faithful gear. He never served in the military, never claimed to. When asked about it during a town hall, he once replied, "I serve justice, not flags." That moment was broadcast once on local TV and then disappeared, just like most of his public appearances. He kept to himself, rarely smiled, and made it painfully clear that he did not believe in the spectacle of public gratitude. Years ago, during a Veterans Day ceremony in the same county, Judge Whitmore refused to allow a decorated war medic to speak at a courthouse commemoration. Claimed it was a misuse of government property. The man had saved 12 lives under fire, but Whitmore saw a microphone and a uniform and said, "No, this is not a platform." He didn't hate veterans, that's what he told himself. He just hated distractions. And medals, shiny, loaded, worn like statements, those were distractions. So when he saw Arnold Schwarzenegger walk into his courtroom wearing one, he didn't see a man. He saw a provocation. A threat to the sterile order he'd spent decades perfecting. A symbol that spoke louder than he was willing to allow. He'd known Arnold would be called to testify. The name was on the docket. He had even reviewed the file personally that morning, fingers tapping on the man's name longer than necessary. He didn't care about the past. He cared about the rules. Everyone had to follow them. That was what gave the law its power. Without uniformity, the whole thing collapsed. When Arnold stepped forward, Judge Whitmore didn't wait for introductions. He seized the moment, asserted control, stripped the scene of emotion with a single command: remove the medal. Not because it violated decorum, but because it reminded him of something he would never be, and that discomfort had to be silenced. Now, from the bench, Whitmore watched him. The medal was gone, the man was seated. And the courtroom had returned to its quiet hum. On the surface, he had won, but something felt off. He couldn't place it. The usual satisfaction didn't come. Instead, there was a shift in the room's gravity, subtle but real. He noticed the glances people gave, not to him, but to the object Arnold had left on the table. The absence of the medal made it louder somehow. And then, from the farthest corner of the room, a small movement, barely a ripple. The man in military dress, the one who had gone unnoticed until now, slowly lifted his head. He didn't speak. He didn't react. He simply nodded once slowly. It wasn't clear if the nod was meant for the judge, for Arnold, or for something else entirely. But Whitmore saw it, and for a brief second, something in his jaw tightened. Not fear, not yet, just pressure, the kind that comes before a storm. He cleared his throat, adjusted his robe, and looked away. Because in that moment, even he could feel it. Authority was still his, technically, but respect, that was slipping, quietly, like sand from a clenched fist. And in his courtroom, that was the one thing he thought he never had to fight for, until now. The silver medal lay on the wooden ledge beside the microphone, quiet and gleaming under the overhead lights. It didn't belong there, not next to legal pads and case files and glasses of untouched water. It was a grave marker dressed in gold trim, exiled from the chest it had earned. Arnold sat in the witness chair, hands folded gently, not tightly. His fingers were still, but there was something in the angle of his shoulders that betrayed the weight he carried. Not from the room, not from the judge, from somewhere deeper. The attorney approached the stand carefully, like walking across ice that might crack under the wrong question. "Mr. Schwarzenegger," he began, his voice lower than usual, "can you please state your name and occupation for the record?" Arnold didn't move at first. Then he turned his head slightly, just enough to be heard. "Arnold Schwarzenegger," he said, each syllable carved like stone. "Retired public servant, volunteer, former soldier." The room didn't move. The words weren't surprising, but they landed differently when said that way, without bravado, without explanation, just facts, facts that had roots. "And Mr. Schwarzenegger," the lawyer continued, "were you present at the location in question on April 14th of this year?" "I was. Why? I was checking the perimeter." A pause. "The town asked me to inspect the flood damage after the last storm." The judge shifted in his seat but said nothing. The gallery remained still. "Can you describe what you saw that day?" Arnold nodded once. The southern trail had been blocked. Barbed wire, fresh stakes. Signs posted that read, "Private access only." "I followed the fence line west, toward the firebreak zone. There was a new gate where the community shed used to be." "And did you have permission to enter that area?" Arnold's jaw tightened slightly. Then calmly, "I had a master key, issued by the Volunteer Response Board. I've used it since 2019. "And who gave it to you?" "The previous fire chief, Dan Rivers." There was a flicker then. Someone in the crowd inhaled quietly, a name like that meant something in this town. Rivers had died in that fire 5 years ago. Everyone remembered. The attorney hesitated. "Why did he give you that access?" Arnold looked straight ahead. Not at the judge, not at the gallery. His voice didn't rise, but it sank deeper. "Because I was there when the last rig went down. I helped carry his son out of that forest. He didn't make it past the ridge line. Dan gave me the key after the memorial." There it was, just like that. A truth so heavy it pulled the temperature out of the room. The back door creaked faintly as someone adjusted in their seat. A man in the third row touched his temple, as if shielding himself from something invisible. The attorney didn't ask the next question. He didn't have to. Arnold continued. "That area wasn't just open, it was sacred. No one developed it. No one claimed it. It was where we buried the ashes. The trees grew back slower there." Silence, again, not the awkward kind, the kind that settled on the shoulders of everyone listening. "Mr. Schwarzenegger," the lawyer finally asked, "when you saw the new fencing, what did you feel?" Arnold blinked once, like someone had locked a cemetery. That was it, that was the line, the one that turned the air inside out. A courtroom designed for zoning codes and fence lines had just been dragged into something older, something moral. At the judge's bench, Whitmore's expression didn't change, but his pen stopped moving. From the corner of the gallery, the man in the military dress didn't look up. Not yet, but his breathing changed, just slightly. Arnold folded his hands again. He didn't ask for pity. He didn't need applause. He had told the truth. and the room knew it, even those who didn't want to, even the ones who wished he had never shown up. The medal still sat beside the mic, unworn, but louder than anything else in that courtroom. The opposing counsel stood with the ease of someone who had never once questioned his place in a room like this. Crisp suit, polished shoes, tie knotted just tight enough to impress, but loose enough to say he was comfortable. Young, sharp, the kind of lawyer who spoke in carefully rehearsed pauses and wore his confidence like cologne. He approached the stand slowly, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Mr. Schwarzenegger," he began, pronouncing the name like a challenge, "you've had quite the career. Movies, politics, now this." He gestured vaguely at the courtroom. "I have to admit, you certainly know how to command a room." Arnold said nothing. The lawyer paced once, then turned, his tone light but aimed like a blade. "You've delivered some powerful lines in your life, haven't you? Memorable ones, iconic even, but let me be very clear, sir, this isn't a film set. This is a courtroom. We deal in facts, not flair." A few people shifted in their seats. The smirk widened. "So let's keep the dramatics to a minimum, shall we? I'm sure your script doesn't include land access law, water rights, or easement clauses." He chuckled, then added, "Unless they're planning a sequel." Laughter didn't follow, just the creak of someone leaning forward in the gallery. The air grew tighter. Arnold's gaze didn't move. He didn't blink. His reply came slowly, like the words had to be unearthed. "I didn't read a script that day," he said. "I heard screaming, I followed it. The room stopped breathing. I carried a boy through fire and thought he might live if I kept moving fast enough. He didn't. His helmet melted into my jacket." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at the lawyer. He just let the words land where they would. Behind the stand, the court reporter's fingers hesitated for half a second before catching up. In the back corner, the veteran in uniform finally lifted his head. His eyes locked on Arnold, unreadable. The attorney's smirk faltered, just a blink, barely a pause, but enough. I'm sure that was difficult," he said, reaching for his next point like a man suddenly unsure of his footing. "But again, we're here for land law, not legacy." Arnold didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence did it for him. The judge cleared his throat. "Please continue, counselor," he said, but his voice didn't have the same authority as before. The young lawyer nodded quickly, more to himself than anyone else. He returned to his table with movements less fluid than before, less certain. He glanced down at his notes, but they looked different now. Smaller, insufficient. What he didn't know, not yet, was that his own father, a retired contractor who once ran a rescue supply station during those wildfires, had collapsed from smoke inhalation while helping evacuate the last residents from the canyon. And the man who had pulled him into the truck, whose jacket was soaked in soot and blood, was now sitting on that witness stand, being mocked for speaking plainly. That story hadn't made it to him, not yet. But the truth has a way of surfacing, quietly, just like it was doing now. Arnold folded his hands again, eyes distant, breath even. He wasn't offended. He wasn't trying to win. He was just there, carrying something too heavy for pride and too honest for argument. The medal still sat beside the microphone, untouched, unclaimed, but more visible than ever. From the back of the courtroom, a voice cut through the silence like a blade across still water. It wasn't loud, but it carried, deep, steady, unmistakable. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Every head turned at once. The man who had been sitting motionless in the far corner, dressed in formal military uniform, was now standing. He didn't move toward the front. He didn't adjust his posture or gesture for attention. He didn't need to. The sheer presence of him, upright and composed, commanded every eye in the room. The judge, caught mid-breath, looked up, eyebrows pulling together. "You are Sergeant Major Lucas Granger, United States Army, retired." The name didn't ring bells in the courtroom, but it wasn't meant to. The uniform did enough. Years etched into the lines of his face. Bars and medals lined across his chest like stories told without words. And near the center, unmistakable even from a distance, the Medal of Honor. "I was not subpoenaed," Granger continued, "but I was here. I needed to be." The judge hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "Sergeant, this is a formal proceeding. We can't just allow You allowed a man to be humiliated for wearing a medal, Granger said, not raising his voice. You allowed that in this courtroom. The silence that followed was thicker than anything prior. Even the judge seemed to feel it. Granger's eyes moved from the bench to the witness stand, where Arnold remained seated, unmoved. The medal still rested beside him, untouched. I served alongside this man, Granger said, not in combat, not in Hollywood, in the aftermath, when the reporters left and the politicians gave up their podiums. He took a slow step forward. We were stationed at a relief base outside Ramadi, summer of 2006. Days that started at 400 and ended when they ended. I watched him load crates, dig trenches, carry stretchers. No press, no cameras. One night, a medevac failed to land. Too much smoke from the wreckage. Granger paused, his jaw tightened. There was a kid, a corporal burned bad, breathing shallow. We were told to wait, that no one was coming till dawn. I watched him, this man you ordered to remove his medal, pick that kid up and hold him. For 3 hours, standing, kneeling, whispering his name every few minutes to keep him awake. The courtroom didn't breathe. He never told anyone, refused to sign the report. When the media arrived 3 days later, they tried to hand him a plaque. He walked away. Granger looked toward Arnold now, and his voice softened. I've seen men chase glory. I've seen men run from it. He did neither. He simply carried it. The judge fidgeted, searching for words that wouldn't come. And that medal on the table, Granger said, eyes narrowing, he didn't wear it today for himself. He wore it for my brother, Kyle Granger, firefighter, killed in the Bakersfield wildfire. Arnold carried his body out of the blast zone, 3 miles, uphill, through ash and broken trees. That medal was pinned by Austria, but it carries more than European gratitude. It carries Kyle. Gasps came then, small, stunned, involuntary. Someone in the gallery covered their mouth. Another bowed their head. Granger stepped closer to the stand. He didn't touch Arnold. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned to the judge. You tried to reduce this man to silence, he said, to strip him of what isn't yours to take. But honor doesn't live on paper, and it doesn't bow to robes. It walks in quietly. It carries bodies no one else will carry. And sometimes it sits in a courtroom and says nothing, because it knows words are too small. He faced Arnold once more. The two men exchanged no nods, no gestures, just a long, heavy look that said everything. Then Granger reached for the medal. Slowly, gently, as if it were glass, he lifted it with both hands and turned toward the room. This is not a costume, he said. It is a tombstone made of metal. He placed it back on the table, not beside the microphone, in front of Arnold. And for the first time Arnold stood. The movement was simple, quiet, but it changed everything. The air shifted. The room aligned itself to his presence. They faced each other, two men, both older, both marked by fire in different ways. Then wordlessly they embraced, not like friends, not like heroes, like brothers who had both carried too much for too long. When they stepped apart, Arnold didn't pin the medal back on. He held it in his hand. Granger turned back to the judge one final time. You may control the schedule, he said, but you do not control the story. Then he walked to the back of the courtroom, not in haste, not for effect, just with the kind of calm that comes from knowing the truth is finally standing upright. No one dared speak, not the attorneys, not the bailiff, not even the judge. Justice had left its bench and walked out wearing boots. It started with one man near the back. He stood slowly, no expression on his face, no gesture to signal why. He just rose to his feet and remained still. Then another. A woman in a faded blue sweater, her eyes wet, hands folded tightly at her waist. Then two more, an older couple, their backs slightly curved, but postures suddenly upright. Within moments, a quiet chain reaction swept across the courtroom. One by one, people began to stand. No words, no shuffling, just the steady rhythm of presence. They weren't protesting, they weren't applauding, they were simply there, standing. The judge noticed it almost too late. His gavel hovered in the air, indecisive. Then he snapped, "This is a court of law, sit down at once." No one moved. He tried again, louder. "I said, I am the authority here. You will sit or be removed." Still no one moved. Arnold remained standing too, unmoved, holding the medal in his hand, eyes on the floor. Beside him, the space around him now felt like a clearing, like the center of something sacred. The judge's voice cracked slightly. "I will clear the room if necessary." But there was no one to remove, no one disorderly, just people, standing. A row of firefighters stood shoulder to shoulder. A man with a burn scar down the side of his face stood next to a teenage boy with his hand over his heart. An elderly woman near the front, hair silver, spine straight, whispered something under her breath and wiped her eyes. Then from the front row, a small voice broke the silence. It was a girl, no older than 10. She stood beside her mother, her small hand holding tightly to her mother's coat, her face pale but determined, her chin lifted. "My daddy died in that fire," she said. The words hit the room like a pin to glass. The judge blinked. She didn't stop. "You don't get to take away what he left behind." The mother tried to pull her gently back into the seat, but the girl didn't budge. She looked straight at the judge. "You don't get to take away honor." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The judge sat back slowly. His hands dropped from the bench. His shoulders slumped in a way that made him seem smaller, not by size, but by measure. For the first time in years, Judge Harold Whitmore didn't look like a man in control. He looked like a man outnumbered by truth. He didn't speak again, didn't gavel, didn't gesture. He just sat there as the silence swallowed the bench and the room stood taller without him. Weeks passed. The courtroom faded into routine again. New cases, new names, new arguments over contracts and boundaries, but something had shifted. The room no longer carried the same gravity. The bench no longer commanded the same stillness. And Judge Harold Whitmore was no longer on the schedule. Officially, it was called early retirement, quiet, unannounced. The courthouse issued a single sentence, personal reasons, but no one needed more than that. Somewhere along the way, a photo began to circulate. Grainy, taken from a distance. No headline, no caption. It showed Arnold standing alone in front of a blackened memorial wall, the kind erected for first responders who had fallen during the wildfire. No crowd, no speeches, no flag waving in the background. He wore a dark jacket, hands clasped in front of him. The medal wasn't pinned to his chest. It wasn't in his hand. It was nowhere in sight. Later that week, someone posted another image. This one quieter. A photo of a living room shelf, wood-stained dark, a simple glass case resting in the center. Inside it, the grand decoration of honor. Below it, carved into the base of the stand, were 7 words. For the ones who didn't come home. No signature, no story, just that. The man in uniform, Lucas Granger, was never interviewed, never appeared on television. He didn't speak to reporters. He left the courtroom that day and disappeared into the same silence he had emerged from. But months later, internal documents from the state's judicial board revealed a formal complaint. Filed by a retired military officer. No name listed publicly, but some knew. The complaint cited public misconduct, dishonoring of service, and abuse of symbolic authority. It carried weight. Enough that sponsors pulled support from the judge's re-election campaign. Enough that 2 ethics organizations filed briefs in agreement. Enough that the bench went silent. Arnold never commented. He returned to his routines, morning walks, volunteer drives, quiet meetings with burned-down towns rebuilding from ash. He didn't hold press conferences, didn't make statements. When asked by a local radio host if he had anything to say about what happened, he simply paused and said, "There's nothing more to explain." He didn't need to. The story was no longer about a courtroom or a judge or even a medal. It was about silence, the kind that speaks without permission, the kind that stands up when dignity is challenged, the kind that doesn't need an audience to matter. And in that silence, something remained standing, something that looked a lot like honor. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.